Far out across the galaxy of Imperial territory on the eastern rim, on the very edge of recorded Imperial worlds, lay a system around a binary star designated as XCV-103. The Imperium dispatched Chief Orbologist Luteus Vox to head an expeditionary team to investigate the singular world orbiting the star, which was seemingly devoid of life. It was titled Angelus. Contact was lost with the expedition soon after, and they subsequently disappeared. Only initial preliminary reports had been received before astropathic contact was lost and then no longer possible. The warp had closed off the ability to reach the planet amid warp disturbances. No detailed record was maintained, as no full picture was available regarding the status of the exploratory team. The team itself is entered by Imperial administrators as contact lost and status unknown. The planet was regarded as dead. What became of the exploratory force and what they stumbled upon was a bizarre tale of Xenos species embedding themselves upon Angelus. What happened to the human explorators was even more strange, for as they would eventually discover, the world was, in some respects, far from being fully dead, and soon enough its uninhabited wastelands would, once again, become considerably more active. The planet known as XCV-103 before the Imperium designated it as Angelus was regarded in the early period of the Imperium as a dead world with little signs of life ever having existed there. It was a barren rock, but did display some strange signs of structure on its surface. Luteus Vox and his team crewed the ship Eternal Vigilance, which has been sent to XCV-103 to perform archaeological surveys upon the world. This is fairly standard for the Imperium, and specifically the Adeptus Mechanicus, as they are always searching for lost archaeotech and potentially STCs. Sometimes these are discovered upon worlds which appear dead and barren, but below the surface are often technological complexes from the dark age of technology which deliver huge rewards. Though it seems worthwhile to note that at this specific moment in human history, when these explorators arrived upon this world, the Imperium was in the midst of the Nova Terra Internum. This was a fractured period where divisions were appearing among the Mechanicus and several Imperial sectors in the western reaches of Imperial Galactic territory, so close attention was likely not going to be paid to a small exploratory team who had been voyaging for some time to reach this most eastern rim of the galaxy. Initial logs from orbit describe strange energy patterns being read upon the world, comprising waves and fluctuations of energy spikes. It is speculated that it could represent some kind of beacon. This is tracked to an area containing what are believed to be Xenos structures on the surface of the world. Upon this discovery, additional Archaeo-Explorator teams are requested, and the estimated time of arrival for them to the world is 4 months. The Imperials continue expanding their searches on the surface, scanning for both Xenos structures, unusual mineral deposits, or other signs of life. None are immediately forthcoming. More strangely, they discover that the planet itself does not appear to contain any bacteria, viruses, or other nano-organisms. The planet seems to have at some point suffered a complete and total extinction of life, described by the Imperials as being artificial in nature. They also record extremely low presence of water, and as they continue to process their data, explorators find there is little sign of thermonuclear irradiation of the world, ruling out devastating wars of the past or other catastrophic events. The atmosphere is strangely noted to be also deteriorating, and no natural cause is immediately attributable. Water density also continues to drop, but they can find no direct correlation to the planet's situation and its natural aridity. After further assessments of planetary erosion and the detected signs of whatever life had once existed on the planet, the exploratory team conclude the planet to have been dead since the Dark Age of technology, or even before this time. Luteus Vox notes how he is particularly concerned by the seemingly artificial nature by which the planet appears to have been exterminated, describing how "I have never encountered a planet so devoid of life as this, without any unnatural cause to attribute for it." The investigator teams are now concentrated toward the site designated as Xenos structures. The Imperials have noted energy levels appear to have been surging since their arrival. They cannot make any more detailed assessments, however, based on the information available, but they note that the energy waveforms are of an unknown type, and their increasing scale is concerning. These energy signatures are tracked to a position several miles below the surface, and low-level surface scans fail to find any more information of structures or former habitation. However, secondary energy sources are logged across hundreds of other areas. The structures being pyramidal in design are scanned, but their elements are unknown and deny the investigators any further detailed assessment. The explorers believe the coming Archaeo team may be more successful in determining the nature of these materials and structures. Chief Luteus Vox notes how the planet is contradictory in nature, a dead world, yet clearly having been occupied at some point. It seems devoid of life, but active energy signatures are found, and Vox requests further scanning teams and detailed Archaeo analysis teams to scour this planet to determine just exactly what is going on here, but reiterates that the eradication of life cannot be attributed to a specific cause. He notes this bears troubling similarity to other worlds in the region. When the additional Archaeo exploration teams arrive, a base station for the Imperials is established on Angelus. This will enable them to continue to carry out their explorations in a more substantial fashion. The team is headed by Site Director Saul Magellan, who quickly confirms that these structures are indeed Xenos in nature. But the material itself seems impervious to all scans and even psychic probing. To our knowledge, of course, it's quite obvious that this material is blackstone. The Archaeo teams begin dig sites around the structures and below the surface to try and unearth more information. They note that 3 pyramidal structures appear to potentially have some relationship to star positioning, although this is noted with skepticism. The most interesting structure is what appears to be another pyramid some 10 kilometers from the others, but which appears damaged or dismantled or unfinished perhaps. Saul Magellan notes that he will lead an expedition to this newly discovered structure and to follow on with further details soon. The last details from the exploratory team come in the form of a recovered fragment of a journal entry describing the activities of Paleologos on Angelus. Its final description is indicative that it was the Imperial explorers, in their ignorance of the Xenos tomb complexes, who may have triggered what was to come next, and be the doom of them all. This journal entry describes how an explorator, Torsen, had led a team into one of the pyramid's antechambers, from which a sarcophagus had been removed already by explorers Gorman and Adler. The internal conditions are described as challenging, with significant debris and sand blocking their filters and other breathing apparatus. More extraction teams are ordered to assist. Torsen progresses into the tomb, further using a guide rope that has been set to allow the explorers to find their way through the darkness and the atmosphere, thick with dust. He observes how the walls are covered with glyphs of an unknown origin, and he describes the conditions in the antechamber as having improved, and now he is able to see even more of these glyphs covering the entire surface of the chamber. Geometrically arranged rows of script forming intricate patterns, and Torsen notes they are of indescribable beauty. It seems that from this he is able to identify the builders, as Torsen now names the species as the Necrontyr, and that he feels a strange bond of closeness, as if he were being called across the gulf of tens of millions of years. The entry ends here. No further communication to the Imperium is sent.
You do a lot to protect your family right now. We're here to help you protect them in the future. Safeguard your family with a will, trust, or power of attorney from LegalZoom. Let's make it official.
Goodbye and the spam calls. Hello to a phone plan with built-in spam blocking. See you later. Networks that are unsafe. Hello, built-in VPN. Now the networks I join are private. So long, hackers and trackers finding my personal information. Hello to a phone plan that keeps me safe and secure. Goodbye, everything you can. Hello, Google Fi, phone plan that can.
Now, it's anyone's guess as to whether the activities of the Imperial explorators were linked with what was to come next, or if it were a bizarre event of no relation that occurred by chance, for the warp is an inexplicable realm where ships can be chewed up and spat out, for this is exactly what is told to have then happened upon Angelus. Space hulks are not merely derelict ships, they are vast structures floating through the void of the warp, and often they are a mixture of other ships, even sometimes masses of rock, asteroid or planetoid. They're a conglomeration of things all compacted together by huge collisions in the warp and or material space. They form miles of twisted craft and mazes of corridors, potentially even hundreds of miles dependent on the size of the structure formed. But some space hulks originate from a dark age of technology, or even before this time. Some space hulks are in fact whole fleets of ships who have been crushed into a singular mass by the tempest of the Immaterium, and have steadily accumulated other ships thrown together over centuries or millennia. For as we know, time in the warp is not measurable comparative to real space, so these hulks can drift on the seas of warp energy for theoretically millennia by our standards, before they drift into a weak point between the warp and real space where the dimensions converge, and then without warning, a space hulk can drift or be expelled into the Materium. When this occurs, Imperial forces may attempt to search a hulk, as it may contain lost archaeotech, potentially even STC fragments, or other species like Tyranids will often seed hulks with their aggressive Xenos strain, the Gene Stealers, with the aim of them potentially serving as launching points or scouts for hive fleets. The other Xenos, of course, to use space hulks are the Orcs, who will use hulks to transport themselves across the vast spaces between regions of the galaxy. Orc-mechs will deliberately create tractor beam generators, often the size of small towns on a planet, and they will use this to trap a space hulk in real space to then allow Orcs enough time to get aboard via conventional rockets or teleporting tech that the Orcs call teleporters. The Orc-mechs will then create an energy bubble in part of the space hulk so the Orcs can safely remain within. As often space hulks are extremely unstable, not to mention of course the far more serious threat of entering the warp, but also against the void of space. Finally, the Orc-mechs will reverse their tractor beam devices to give the space hulk a kick back into the warp. They will often then build further energy bubble generators on board the hulk to expand their workable area, as there is never a scrap shortage on a space hulk, and eventually they may even be able to construct engines and tools to allow them to steer the hulk in a very crude fashion. Often though, they will say that it is the will of Gork and Mork where they end up. And for the world of Angelus, the Orc gods had seemingly determined that this is where the Orcs would be deposited. For around the time that the Imperials were making their early assessment, the planet of Angelus held a Necron tomb below its surface. Without any warning, a huge rip in real space would appear, and out from this would be expelled a colossal space hulk, which came barreling toward the planet, and more importantly, directly toward the Eternal Vigilance, which ironically was clearly not being especially vigilant, for they were unable to avoid the oncoming mass. This huge warp disturbance immediately severed all communications between the Imperials and long-range astropaths, and this would remain the case for some time. The space hulk itself was dragged out of the warp, it's said, by gravimetric forces, and as it entered the planet's atmosphere. The specifics of just what came first, some kind of gigantic blast from the planet, or the hulk smashing into the planet, are unknown, and now likely never will be. Did the human explorators unintentionally trigger an ancient Necron device, or was this a mere chance of fate? Unknown. But what seems sure is that the hulk which tore free from the warp itself was pulled to the planet by the forces which had been scanned by Imperial explorators, and this hulk on its collision path with Angelus smashed straight into the Imperial ships orbiting the world. Eternal Vigilance was now no longer vigilant nor eternal, as the entire mass of space wreckage would plough straight into the surface of the planet, much of it vaporizing on impact, and anything else scattering widely across the surface. It was believed that all Imperials aboard those orbiting ships to have perished, as one might imagine, from having a space hulk ram them straight into the surface of the world. Likely nothing was believed to have remained of those ships. The Hulk itself was said to have been burned off to a degree through its severe angle of descent, but then the vaporization of impact, as well as it striking roughly upon the equatorial line of the planet, would cause it to carve into the planet a gigantic scar, which extended for something like 1,000 miles. The Hulk distributed whatever materials remained all across this huge planetary scar, and wider field as well, not to mention other materials which broke off in orbit and some which would burn up, others raining down periodically for centuries. Dust and radiation would heavily contaminate the atmosphere of Angeles for as long as a full decade. Despite the extreme impact of the ship annihilating all Imperial forces in orbit, there had been a significant base camp set up upon the world itself, and seemingly at the point at which the Hulk impacted Angeles, a reasonable amount of the personnel on the surface were investigating the Necron ruins below. How much time they had to react to what clearly would have been a very obvious visual event is unknown. It's possible that only a few of the explorator team on the surface made it underground, or they may have made it with a good percentage of their forces, including who can know what supplies, tools, and provisions. Yet for whatever force had managed to reach the safety of the tombs below the surface, they were now completely isolated, being buried here, and the coming years would only bury them further below decades of settling dust and vast storms which blew huge deserts of sand and material across the sight of the explorators. These events took place during M35, and now the only accounts of what came next is told from the descendants of those survivors, now in the period of M41, thousands of years later. In what is referred to as the period of darkness, the bizarre descendants of the Imperial explorators describe to us how they have no knowledge of what happened on the surface. They simply refer to it as the Big Blast, and that the entrances to the pyramids collapsed, burying them below the surface. They also have no timescale for how long subsequent events are placed at, but it's said that during the period of darkness, the strict sense of order among their ancestors was soon lost after the Big Blast. They describe how, having fallen from grace, their ancestors soon struggled for both light and food, and in desperation would turn upon each other. As I've noted previously, no matter the seeming security and order and structure in human societies, it takes a short period without food or water for things to quickly deteriorate into a brutal survival of the fittest, especially in extreme conditions such as these. So seemingly the Imperials were quickly brought to desperation by their situation, or perhaps disagreements, and fought among themselves. Their descendants describe these struggles over what is said to be artifacts of magical power that could produce food from the air and light, which burned for a lifetime. They refer to this period as the Tribal War, and it's said that from this initial conflict, several tribes split off and went deeper into the tunnels to find areas to inhabit for themselves. Time passes by, and the tribes have grown across generations, and with each generation, they spread their camps further into the dark corridors of the pyramid complexes. This leads to what is called the Backstab War, where the limited space and territory available to the ancestors caused them to fight over the best areas adjacent to their tribal camps. Then came what is titled as the Wrecker War. This is the most strange turn of events, and none can truly know just how or why it came to pass. It's said that a new tribe appears, known as the Wreckers, who are said to have ventured further and deeper into the darkest tunnels. They talk of strange horrors preying on the tribes and stalking tunnels. Things continue to worsen, and it's said the tribes entered into a nightmarish time where their finest warriors were mercilessly slaughtered in the darkness. Evil monsters from the depths roamed the corridors now, and the death and mutilations reached a horrific scale. Camps were destroyed, many lives lost, but then the so-called Wreckers returned from the dark depths, and not to be their saviours, for they brought with them only more of these monstrous horrors, and somehow had aligned themselves with these beings. It's unknown just how this was possible, but it's said that the Wreckers and their allies deluged through the tunnels like a ravaging swarm. Their ultimatum to the tribes was simple: surrender or be destroyed. Some tribes attempted to fight back, but no record of them remains past this time. Many other tribes would submit to the Wreckers, and it's told how these Wreckers then further split the tribes by taking positions of leadership within their communities. It's said But all tribes now existed in a state of fear of one another, a tension that is said to exist to this day, for none would seek to impose another intertribal war, knowing the horror that could be unleashed upon one another should this occur. This relationship, seemingly between the Necron and the Wreckers, is an extremely bizarre one, and something that has not been since explained in any way, shape or form, and remains entirely open to speculation just what it all means. The descendants of these tribes, though, now talk about the so-called Big Dig. The tribes continue to remain in the depths of the pyramids for further generations, and now the Wreckers were running things. Other areas that were previously inaccessible became open to the tribes, and this enabled them to discover in time what they believed were the collapsed entrances to the surface lost generations previous. This discovery prompted the so-called Big Dig, where tribes sent their strongest warriors and presumably excavators to remove the collapsed debris around the entrances with the goal of the tribes once again reaching the surface and the light. Many would die through the harsh nature of the work, not to mention rockfalls and roof collapses. Oceans of sand would sometimes pour in, burying workers alive in suffocating deluges. The tribes, though, had their set goal in mind, and it was such a huge project, work continued for many years. After some time, though, many of the workers began to report strange sounds from above, grunts, roars, and other bizarre sounds. The tribes became fearful of what awaited them, what was out there still. They continued on more tentatively until one day an exit from the tombs was created. A huge collapse brought light beaming in, and more with it. As deafening sounds echoed into the chambers, the tribes saw once again the light of the surface. But as they gathered around their exit, they saw in horror and amazement huge stalking shapes moving around. They were massive, and they were green. Huge jaws packed with teeth, gigantic bulging muscles. The tribes cowered in fear, but the wreckers stepped forward with courage. These green-skinned hulks now looked upon the tribespeople with what seemed like confusion. As more of the tribal humans stumbled out onto the slopes of the vast deserts before them, their initial fear soon turned to awe, as they saw hundreds of these green beasts stomping up and down the dunes, digging and moving rocks with huge mechanical claws. The air was filled with the sounds of excavation, rocks being split, detonations, sand removal, big machines roaring as they worked. And still further in the distance, there was an area of plateau where the green things were seemingly racing around on powerful vehicles, and others were arguing or even just fighting among themselves, some randomly firing weapons. The wreckers looked at their own drab, ragged clothes, and then looked at the bright, exciting colours and styles of the beasts, and were amazed and excited by such visions of creativity. They were braver still, and ventured out as they stood in amazement at the spectacle of these big green beasts, who shoved them aside and stared back, but showed them little other interest. Eventually, a huge green beast they would later know as a mech strode up to them. He towered over the wrecker tribespeople and looked upon them with his big red eyes, and then, snarling, uttered a single word: "Diggers." From the perspective of the human tribes who had until now been surviving through crude, blunt tools and really only scratching out bare, minimal survival in the darkness, the brightness of the surface was only made brighter and more invigorating by the exciting colours and activity of what they would soon overhear and learn were calling themselves the Orcs. The Orcs paid little attention to these scrawny Umis at first, for as violent as Orcs are, they're not focused like the Imperium or Tyranids on scouring all that are not like them from the galaxy. However, human worlds, once they've been crushed by an Orc war, will not be exterminated necessarily, but usually the humans are enslaved by the Orcs, fulfilling whatever work orders they need, or perhaps just for amusement. Fighting each other, for example. Fighting squigs, fighting grots, fighting snots, fighting whatever, basically. The point is, the Orcs didn't immediately slaughter the tribes from the depths of the pyramids, but they were fine with the need to immediately enslaving them, under penalty of having their heads bashed in. The Orcs supervising heard these Umi diggers speaking about buried tech in the tunnels, and took any of this they could get hold of to sell to their mechs. The diggers, who had been initially awed by the Orcs, were unsurprisingly enjoying less being subjugated by them. But what could they do? Orcs were bigger and brutal in fighting. The fate of the diggers seemed unfortunately sealed. They thought that the surface would bring them freedom. Instead, it brought them the opposite. Soon though, on one fabled night, as told by the descendants of the tribes, now happy to title themselves the Diggers, it is said that from the depths of the tunnel came the allies of the Wreckers, and those Orcs in and around the tunnels of the pyramids were quickly slaughtered. The few who ran off into the darkness of the night lived to tell other Orcs, but all that could be seen in the light of day were no bodies, but ruined machines, broken weapons, scorched ground, and a lot of black dust. The fleeing Orcs were soon found, scattered into the desert out of their minds, picked up by other Orcs on scavenging wagons, rambling about gleaming eyes in the darkness, and that the pyramids had glowed with power before portals spilled out an army of terror that their weapons were blazing light and other orcs were dragged off to the depths of the pyramids. The orcs would never return to this area. They left it for the diggers, giving it the appropriate name of Morgarg, Durlurk, Gulskar, Dreg Snick Slag, or for the Umis, the fortress of ancient terrifying power, land of waiting death, pain and destruction.
It's all real.
Has begun.
We'll see when it's like. Let's give them one.
At we make life on the go easy. That's why we created Licky, the world's most compact folding trike. It fits in any car or airplane overhead bin, so you can take it with you however you may be traveling. Ready to explore? Visit shoptuna.com.
Strangely, the orcs seemed not to hold this incident against the diggers, and so in time when the diggers approached the orc shanty towns, they were seemingly appearing in steadily increasing size. They found they were able to also trade the technology salvaged from the pyramids with the orc mechs, and for their trouble they gained shooters of their own. Orc mech demand for the tech from the pyramids grew, and so developed a roaring trade, where the diggers, own expert, began scouring for old weapons and seeking tech from the depths of the pyramids. Moreover, as the diggers began to learn about orc technology, it enabled them to think more about their own clubs and jewellery that they themselves had held for so long. They began to discover that the things they collected over the years were more than they seemed to be. Some of their strange weapons were not in fact clubbing tools, but shooters themselves. Some of their bangles and other jewellery, when manipulated correctly, could seem to produce energy shields. Trading with the orcs for the diggers meant more than just some rough shooters and goods. It actually brought to them a gift of knowledge. And now they are able to think far more about the tech they have and just what it means. The orcs' fear of the diggers' pyramids would ease, but they would rarely, if ever, dare to return to the pyramid plateau itself. The orcs on Angelus have come to view the diggers as an amusing tribe who they tolerate mainly out of necessity, for without the diggers they couldn't access the treasures of the pyramids, and bizarrely the diggers themselves continue to be excited by the bright and noisy activities of the orcs and seek to emulate and even integrate themselves further with the orcs. The diggers, now in the modern era of M41, are led by these so-called wreckers, and bizarrely over the generations, they now seek to fully emulate the orcs, even going so far as to try and make themselves look more orky. They wear outfits to bulk up their appearance, they create claws and artificial fanged jaws, they decorate their armour and vehicles in orky colours and designs, and strangest of all, they will even go so far as to paint themselves green, wanting to make themselves literally into a pseudo-orc society. This is of course much to the amusement and entertainment of orcs, who find this new digger mob all the more hilarious. It should be noted again that orcs being amused or even mildly respecting of humans is not without precedent, the most notable of course being Commissar Yarak, who orcs are often regarded as being orc-like, not least because he decapitated an orc war boss, much to the fear of the nearby orcs who bowed to a superior fighter, but the myth of Yarak among the orc was a curious one. For those who had heard of this legendary Umi boss were always surprised by how small in reality he was, much to their disappointment. So, similarly to this, the orcs have come to regard the diggers something like honorary orcs, in the crudest framing of that concept. The diggers continue to adapt their tech to their needs and wear as much shiny things as possible, adorning themselves and their vehicles with bones, crystals, and whatever they think looks impressive. They sometimes expand their looting parties to search for scrap around the desert that they have learned came from the Hulk. They'll also fight territorial battles with other digger mobs, as each tribal mob seeks the best scrap to take to the orcs' big town that became known as Mech Town. They also fight against what are known as the Grot Rebels or the Gretchen Revolutionaries. Again, this is to emulate their orc neighbours, for the diggers still crave to be immersed in orc culture, even going so far as to take on terms from orc mobs for their own. For example, the youngest scavenger fighters in a digger mob will be known as youths. The older diggers are known as digger boys, and then you have digger shamans, who are said to be attuned to the environment and excellent at scouting tech. They also seem to be able to subconsciously predict things around them, as if they can see the future, and apparently performing rituals enables them to do this even stronger and with more accuracy. But just what these digger shamans are though, who knows? And of course you have the digger knobs. It's like orc knobs. These are bigger and more adventurous members in a digger mob, and they'll have stronger leadership and confidence, as well as having a reputation for cracking skulls. Just like the orcs, it seems the way your standard digger becomes a knob is by some good fighting. So this is something a digger knob is always watching for among his mob. To the orcs, the diggers are a necessary part of their lives on the planet now. They're an amusement to some, an annoyance to others. And some mechs resent having to rely on scrawny Umis for finding the best tech, not to mention having to trade for it and not just take it off of them. For orcs, an Umi will never be a proper orc, and they don't take them seriously. So for this reason, a mech will rarely give the diggers any proper orc tech. Although the orcs control their mech town and the huge scar across the planet near to the town known as the Skid, the planet itself is far bigger than this one small area, and out there the orcs hold far less control. But there is another faction who have emerged on the world of Angelus, who fight against both the orcs and the diggers. And no, it's not the grots. Out in the wastes are built various forts, and it's from here the orcs' most bitter rivals fight them across the barren wastes of Angelus, or as it's known to the orcs, Gorka Morka. The so-called muties harbour a bitter resentment toward the orcs, for the muties hold some records going back into the history of Angelus and just how they came to find themselves in this bleak and harsh landscape. The muties know that originally they came from a highly advanced race, so advanced they had mastered the skies and the stars. It's said that their ancestors travelled out among the stars aboard a huge ship, and their ancestors are said to have not been like the muties are now. No, they had smooth bodies, and they were very content with this. Though came the day when their world was ruined. Their ancestors were thrown to the surface of the planet, and it's said this was the fault of the Greenskins. Their Hulk ripped their ancestors' sky ship down from its place among the stars, and it's said that the Orc Hulk smashed into the planet in the region they now call the Skid. But the Muties' ancestors' vessel crashed down also into the deep desert, much destroyed by its heavy impact, but a large section remained intact, including some survivors of the ship. These ancestral survivors now had to contend with a world racked by dust storms, burning hot days, freezing nights, and soon also they discovered toxic gas and radiation spewing and contaminating the atmosphere from the Hulk far away. The survivors seemingly had no way to contact others who travelled among those stars, and so they were stranded. With each generation, changes in them began to appear. It is said the poisonous atmosphere caused by the Orc Hulk is the cause of this, and so many of the survivors were becoming forms that they now termed muties. Many would die, though, from these aberrations, and some of their bodies became simply too weak, others where bones became twisted, some found other dysfunctions in limbs, eyes. The strongest though would survive through each generation, and soon the smooth-skinned survivors were long forgotten. But those who were left had to contend with the realization that they would never again take that form they had once been so long ago, and this brought much bitterness and anger among the muties towards the orcs. Unlike the diggers, however, the Society of Survivors did not turn in on themselves in tribalistic infighting. The survivors instead passed on their knowledge, their people's story and their quest for the future generations, for they still hope one day that those among the stars will be their salvation. Over the years, the muties have been able to restore power and capability to some sections of what now forms their town of sorts. Dwelling, perhaps, is a better description. Some came to call it the Iter Vigila, after they discovered some letter forms learned through generations upon a section of their realm, and this was adopted as the title for their domain. Centuries of work scavenging and most importantly passing of information has enabled the muties to restore much power and other systems. One of their greatest discoveries was upon unlocking access to data terminals, gifting them significant stores of information, although much of it was confusing and beyond their understanding. Blackouts and short circuits unfortunately occur often, but the muties repair what they can. Above all though, the retention of information, of knowledge, has been long taught as the most important trait of all for the muties society. Those dedicated to this task are known as the Keepers. Whenever new information is found, it is the Keeper's role to record this in their litanies and lore passed on to Keepers' apprentices, along with many scrolls of wisdom. The Keepers continue to hold the history of the muties alive, their secrets, and the memories of their ancestors, who held the hope that one day they might all be saved from this horror. Another aspect of mutie life is another tenet passed down by their ancestors, the so-called quest, and that is the quest for knowledge. The muties put faith in their knowledge and will do all possible to prevent its loss. So the muties now comb through the wastelands seeking for ancient technology from either the Orc Hulk or from fragments of Aether Vigila. It is said that their ancestors tell their forebears maintained camps and bunkers somewhere in this landscape, and they also hunt for this to this day, believing that if found they will contain hordes of valuable tech and knowledge. If any such locations are found, the Keepers absorb the information, iterate it to their apprentices, and that it is handed on to the rulers of the Muties society, for they are responsible for running and updating the files inside of the vast memory databanks of the Aether Vigila. These rulers are known as the Cognoscenti. The Cognoscenti are those who command the society of muties, the Keepers and the Seekers. They maintain a structured society through their dictation of ritual chants and at all costs maintain the grand quest. Another important part of life for the muties and their leadership is the deity they worship known as Magod. This powerful being is said to rule the stars themselves, and that everything which comes to pass is at the behest of Magod. Unsurprisingly, the muties believe that it is their deity's will that the orcs will be exterminated from the planet, and also that their temple to Magod is the Aether Vigila itself. The most holy of these places is at the pinnacle of the ancient ship, where they have founded a temple, and it is said that here it contains some of the most mystifying technological marvels that even the Cognoscenti cannot fathom. Legend tells that one day this temple may be used to communicate directly with Magod, but this has not come to pass yet, as none have been found worthy of this honour. Their legends tell, though, through what they call their Astrath prophecy by great Magos Gorvaz, there will come a time where a mutie who is sufficiently enlightened will be able to use the temple to request aid from Magod against the orcs, the diggers, and the other creatures inhabiting their world. Not only will their enemies be vanquished, but the muties themselves will be physically restored to their original forms, and together they will ascend to the stars to rejoice and embrace Magod. They believe this to their core and patiently await the day it will come to pass. The muties' grand quest is, of course, to recover any and all knowledge from the dangerous wastelands, and this is the task entrusted to the Seekers, the bravest and finest warriors of the muties. Sometimes this brings them into conflict with other pockets and villages of muties who have never heard of Aether Vigila and its grand quest. They have long since lost all knowledge of from whence they came, but they may have hoarded tech that they are now grossly ignorant of its purpose or value. The Seekers also continue the so-called War of Retribution against the Orcs and punish them at any opportunity. Only those with iron will and powerful resolve can survive against the passive, harsh environment of the wastes and the active aggression of the Orc menace. For those Seekers who gain enough renown from partaking in the quest, then they may one day be elevated to the ranks of Cognoscenti and then initiated into learning some of the most secret rites and knowledge of their ancestors, as well as carrying forward the rule over the quest and the occupants of the Aether Vigila. The Cognoscenti have maintained a considerable amount of knowledge spread across millennia. By teaching via the Keepers and their apprentice rites of construction, litanies of energy, and paradigms of maintenance. If it were not, of course, wildly clear, the Society of Muties descends from the Mechanicus, and thus they have a strong focus on retention of knowledge and passing this down through word of mouth if necessary, which it is believed the Mechanicus themselves do with specific tech. The databanks of the Aether Vigila are of course their vault of knowledge, but they still believe in passing it down through generations as a backup for this. They also use scrolls, including original scrolls that it is said are transparent, while others are glowing slabs which flow with text. In the modern time for the muties, they've resorted to handwritten script once again. One core difference, though, between their Mechanicus origins and the Cognoscenti is that the Mechanicus of course believe in the cult of the machine and worship technology. The Cognoscenti have fractured off from this belief. In fact, they consider that one of the reasons their situation came to pass was because their ancestors diverged from the path set by Magog, and that in their quest for mastering machine over the organic, in doing so denying their own true existence, offended Magog. It's reasonable to assume this belief came about from the fact that unlike Mechanicus, the muties lacked the knowledge to continue the physical adaptation so important for Mechanicus, as well of course the actual knowledge itself. So now, the muties believe they must not repeat these errors of the past, and instead they restrict technology to weapons and their maintenance of the Eta Vigila. Unlike the orcs, the muties do not ride around in machine wagons, they ride atop beasts of various form, and indeed the muties use beasts of all variety for different tasks, from energy to general labour. Where these beasts originated from is anybody's guess. It may have been from the Hulk or perhaps the Eta Vigila itself, and these creatures will also be farmed for their food, as well as clothing and hundreds of other uses. The technology held by the muties, it's fair to say, for the most part, surpasses that of the orcs. Their ancient knowledge allows muties to wield weapons of light, heat and plasma, whereas orcs tend to use far more crude projectile weapons. These weapons, though, were only assigned by the cognoscenti, such is their revered value among mutie society. As every year passes, muties continue in holding their devout faith in Magog that soon, via their righteous quest, salvation will come and vengeance upon the orc menace and diggers will finally be dealt out, extinguishing. Then the muties believe they will finally be returned to the stars and become once again their true selves. The tale of planet XCV-103, first designated Angelus and later known to its growing orc population as Gorka, is a fascinating one. We will of course come to the orcs themselves, but I deliberately avoided delving into the more orky things first, as for me what I greatly enjoy is the unfolding events here as witnessed by the human Imperials who arrived simply to carry out a surveying mission. How could they have known such a routine operation would soon leave them stranded upon a barren planet on the rim of the galaxy, left to fend for themselves for the next 5 millennia? For some, this quickly deteriorated into anarchy and would form bizarre quasi-orc society where they struggle to survive with the scraps of the world whilst integrating themselves bizarrely into orc society. But others, as we see, have formed a distorted Mechanicus cult who have sadly become ruined by the toxic pollution brought upon by the Space Hulk, and now quite tragically believe they will be one day reunited with their deity and others like them among the stars. In the modern era of M41, it's recorded that an Ordo-Xenos kill team were deployed to Angelus only to disappear, which honestly seems surprising. Later, we see Ultramarines appearing at some point perhaps to investigate this lost kill team, although the Ultras appear to have, from description, been more focused upon engagements with the Necron, which is also curious. It's a bizarre unknown as to why there is no record of the Diggers attempting to make contact with the modern Imperials when they arrived, although on reflection, it's perhaps as well they did not, for the most likely scenario would be for them to either be simply executed as Xenos collaborating heretics. The only survivors who may have had some glimmer of hope may be the mutants, and I say some because, again, in all likelihood, they would just be killed as abhorrent mutations. The Imperium is not especially open-minded in this regard. However, one might imagine a situation where they could be spared, because if they were the only ones who were keeping some faint flame alive for the Imperium out of this entire incident, even if their true origins have become lost among the foggy mythical storytelling, perhaps were the right Imperial investigator to happen upon them with a curious mind, the right Mechanicus Archaeo team find their specific circumstances interesting enough for study, then it's possible, I think, they may give them some leniency. For myself, out of all of this, the far more bizarre and disturbing aspect remains completely unexplained, which is just why would the Necrons ever collaborate with humans? And what did the Wreckers arrange with them generations previously in the dark depths of the tomb complexes upon the planet of Angelus? Oh, and lastly, if you were unsure, in part 2 we will be exploring the orky side of things. Today's video is brought to you by Audible. Audible is an amazing service which offers a huge selection to listen to, but it is also one of the best ways to make huge savings on 40k audiobooks. The situation with my Audible book club has changed, and I'll have a short video on that very soon. This month I'm listening to the Orc narrative Brutal Cunning. If you want to get involved, check it out for this month's selection. And start listening today with a 30-day Audible trial. Get a free audiobook and full access to thousands of select originals, audiobooks and podcasts included in the Audible Plus plan. Visit audible.com/Lutin or text Lutin to 500-500 for those of you in the US. As always, all relevant links are listed directly below in the video notes. Woe unto the souls of those who turned from the light of the Master of mankind, for truly they reside now with the restless shades of outer night. Heed the lessons they might teach us, for some, duty does not end in death. Their actions echo down the ages, enlightening those who would listen, until the end of all things. Across the galaxy of humanity's reign, the threat of worlds rebelling remains ever present. As if the threat from the Zeniths were not enough, there are some planets and their rulers who forget their place. Often this has been precipitated by the shadowed whispers of beings from the warp or their mortal cult representatives here in Materium. Sometimes it may simply be a disgruntled citizenry who forget just the scale and power of the Imperium. There are endless reasons why it may happen, and very often this answers a commonly asked question. What use is there in creating machines and warriors which instill a sense of fear, power, or terror even, when the forces of humanity wage war against the corrupted Marines, the Orcs, the Tyrannid, the ancient Necron, even the Eldar? Surely they would not look upon the forces of humanity and feel what we would express as fear. Is true enough, although the one exception likely being the Orcs, depending just how many Orcs are stood by their side. They tend to be less confident when not in a massive horde. So where might one need to instill fear and a sense of terror even against an enemy? Where might a weapon like the Sororitas penitent engines best be used? The question has likely answered itself. One of the Imperium's primary tools in retaining order across the galaxy is fear. Fear of what people may face should they rebel, and for those who do, they will soon feel it for themselves. They will be made an example of. While some forces of the Imperium can seem at times a pale imitation of the Astartes, whose honestly a fair assessment, it's worth remembering that those forces will not necessarily spend the majority of their time fighting in world-ending battles against the most extreme enemies of humanity. These battles are reserved for the most elite warriors of humanity, but there are plenty more within the Imperium itself. Battles against breakaway factions and rebellions will often contain many thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, or even millions of dissident citizenry, armed with at least comparable weaponry and potentially even planetary defenses. So even in the modern age of the Imperium, there are planets that will not be calmed by the mere arrival of an Inquisitor, a deployment of Imperial Guard, a Sororitas ship, or maybe not even by a deployment of Marines. Is Exterminatus an option? Always, but remember, as much as the myth surrounding Exterminatus suggests that the Imperium would burn a planet as quickly as they would make a cup of tea, it is in theory at least meant to be a last resort or used as a means to avert some far more severe crisis, like say the spreading corruption of chaos, plague, or other alien infection. Little information has been retained regarding the fate of planet Raphanon. This is likely by design, and only one account is believed to have survived, dictated by an Imperial Historiatrix of a well-respected Lord General of the Imperium. So what follows describes the rise, fall, and subsequent fate of the Raphanon world in the system known as the Protean Ebb. The Imperium refers to humanity's ancient history, that is, human history before the Emperor, even prior to the destructive period known as the Age of Strife, as the Dark Age of Technology. This was a period of high advancement by humanity, but which now nearly all records and information have been lost. In this era, technology reigns supreme, all colony ships had fully functioning STC AI, and humanity had reached out via these into the galaxy with the use of their near-zenith level technology to settle its first colonies and dominate any who opposed them. This period was in fact so advanced that much of the broken remnants of technology used by the Imperium are believed to have originated from this time. The Imperium calls this the Dark Age of technology, as they look back now with hindsight to the time of folly and destruction. But for the humans who lived then, it was their golden age, at least for a time anyway. During this era of humanity, many worlds would be colonized, including the planet known as Rofanon. For the humans of this period, any thoughts of an oppressive Imperium of mankind would be the last thing anybody would have been imagining, if they could even contemplate such a thing. Humans of this time are said to have been far more elevated and beautiful in their thinking, more bright and optimistic for the future of human civilization. And for those who came upon the planet of Rofanon, as with many of these worlds so-called in the Protean ebb, they discovered planets of great beauty without any especially hostile life. However, these early humans did discover that they were not the first to come across these worlds. They found tall towers made from some material they likened to silicate. They found no other signs of life, but these towers and cities appeared deserted. It seems likely, but it is unspecified, that these ancient humans had come across the Eden-like planets of the ancient Eldari. Unlike the modern era of the Imperium, though, their first thought was to not disintegrate these non-human structures to the ground and build directly over them. The humans of the Golden Age were far more advanced in all respects, from their ideology to their ethics, so they instead simply left these places alone and built their new communities elsewhere on the world. But this really is unfortunately all we know of the events around Rofanon in this time. The Golden or the Dark Age of humanity and the Age of Strife which followed have nearly entirely erased human history, both in documentation and physical evidence. All we do know is that by the time the Emperor's Great Crusade arrived at Rofanon many millennia later, they found a world which had not been consumed by anarchy and horror, and instead found a civilized and prosperous world. This was not especially common, but not unheard of within the Great Crusade. The planet of Rofanon saw the benefit in loyalty, perhaps in rejoining humanity at large, although perhaps if they had known the entire picture, it might not have done, at least not quite so readily. But so it would be that the sons and daughters of this world joined the ranks of the nascent Imperium and joined its crusade, which now spanned the entire galaxy. I will note, for those who always inevitably ask, if a planet had survived so well, how did they not retain a functioning STC? The answer is, we don't know. Some STC were recovered during the Great Crusade. It is presumed that during the Dark Age, many humans realized through the events of this time how dangerous artificial intelligence was, and this may have been why so many STC were completely destroyed. This may have been more precautionary than it was necessary, because as we have seen since, some STC encountered by the Imperium do appear to have survived into this era without becoming corrupted or evil from a human perspective. For whatever the reason you wish to opt for, though, few if any worlds were discovered with active intact STC, and for those who were, they were often stolen into the void of the warp by the dark forces of the Mechanicum. What became of these, unknown. Feel free to speculate wildly at will. In the more practical reality of human civilization at this time, humanity had to weather the horrors also of the heresy. The world of Rofanon meant people became very committed to the Imperium, and many grand loyal Imperials were born here to serve humanity. Rofanon served the Imperium and the Emperor well, but like so many planets, devotion and loyalty do not necessarily equate to fair consideration in the affairs of a vast galactic state, and certainly not the state the Imperium would become in the following millennia. Rofanon had escaped the steadily more dystopian and highly oppressive Imperium for the most part. That would be until the period around the turn of M37 and M38, where it was ordained by the High Masters of the Imperial Administratum that Rofanon would become a hub for strategic planning and massive data processing and archiving. Billions of daily reports, briefs, dispatches, and so on would need to be received, processed, acted on, or archived. So Rofanon would be a central data hub for an entire segmentum. What that means is, Rofanon would primarily become a vast data graveyard. Nothing in the Imperium is ever discarded. unless of course something is deliberately erased by whichever branch deemed necessary. So Raphanon would become one of these data tombs, and the Imperium would ship hundreds of millions of scribes, serfs, menials and servitors to the planet, and within the span of a generation, transform its entire society. Very understandably, this did not go down especially well with the planet's population, who had also been simultaneously declared arbitrary subjects of the priesthood of Terra, and its hereditary-based governance system had now become obsolete and was little more than a token gesture of authority. A new High Council for Raphanon was created, and of course chaired by an official, imperial improved commander. This was all a facade, of course. The true rulers of Raphanon were now the Imperial Administratum, and they ruled over every man, woman and child. The planet was entirely subjugated to the will of the Administratum to fulfill whatever duty or function they deemed necessary. The planet's population was now split, with roughly one-third containing deployed Imperial Administratum and their servants, the indigenous population the remaining two-thirds. The populace became unseen and disregarded by the Administratum, who saw them as little more than a peasantry to carry out menial tasks. They had, of course, no rights, no real hope of ever bettering their lives beyond the basic existence of labour and service. Now, in fairness, this is not unusual for Imperial planets, but it's believed to have hit the citizens here harder than most, given the fact that Raphanon was prior to this a very lush garden world, it still was, and its people had always held a more optimistic, perhaps sheltered life than many in the Imperium. So when finally the brutal reality of the Imperium was imposed here, it was perhaps more than the people could take. This was a truly rare circumstance, and an interesting one within the Imperium, in the sense that ordinarily the Imperium was for the most part seen to be something of a relatively positive development for worlds who had suffered through the nightmarish horrors of the galaxy either during the Age of Strife or times since. On Raphanon, though, here we had a world where its citizens appeared to have been very sheltered and seemingly not truly aware of just how good things had been going for them. That even with the fairly oppressive addition of the Administratum, this was still probably one of the best, worst things they could have hoped for. In fact, it likely gave their world even more significance and meant that they would be well protected, in fact. Perhaps even more than previously as a lush, beautiful world, treasured by the Imperium as garden worlds usually are. However, its citizens did not seem to fully appreciate this perspective, nor did they comprehend the fragility of their importance. The sheltered existence of Raphanon had seemingly kept its populace ignorant to this brutality of the Imperium and the uncompromising nature of it. Now, had they resisted when the Imperium originally arrived during the Great Crusade, they would have well learned just what the Imperium was all about. But they did not, and so this naivety and ignorance would prove a costly and tragic error for the citizens of Raphanon. Millennia had now passed since the Administratum came to Raphanon, and the date is now roughly estimated at being around 990 of M40. Sedition is not something which simply explodes out of nowhere among a calm and peaceful state. As I've often said, we rarely see a population rise in disorder until they feel their backs are against the wall and there's nothing to lose. Most people are satisfied to live lives of relative simplicity, providing they're housed, fed, and not living in terrible conditions. One might consider another trigger for rebellion against a government or state is when a population feels something has been abruptly or consistently taken away from them, especially when those things have been the bedrock of a society for generations. And so it was with Raphanon. It took many, many years under the rule of the Administratum before you would begin to see anything that one might describe as heresy. But the seeds of sedition had been sown by the insulting way by which the Imperium and its Administratum had imposed themselves upon the peaceful and, more importantly, loyally dutiful world of Raphanon. Its governing nobility and population felt slighted and subjugated. The dissent stemmed from the council of these hereditary peers who had been relegated to positions that were no more than a facade of authority. They fulfilled their role by day, seemingly bowing to the all-powerful authority of the Administratum, but in the shadows and the cover of night, meetings were held and conversations were had. Bitterness was apparent. And these bitter feelings slowly reverberated into the population, who merely needed the sense of confirmation that their resentment and fears were justified, in order for them to then be recruited to this cause of the disenfranchised citizenry of Raphanon. Not enough time had passed for them to become normalized to laboring as the servants of their imperial masters, and they still felt the passion and desire to live their own lives, trading freely and building their own futures here on this world, and for some even granted the rights to travel off-world. But now, here they were, crushed under the suffocating weight of the imperial bureaucracy, and with every day, month, year, and generation that passed, they felt the need to fight free of its oppression. This bitterness and hatred among the Raphanon population would grow. They continued in their roles, they served, they obeyed, they bowed and scraped a living together. But the council of Raphanon kept the bubbling rage suppressed, and helped constructively direct their frustrations from boiling over prematurely. The leader of this council during this time was one Kruka Vor. Vor had always been of noble blood, and like many of the citizens of Raphanon, had served the Imperium in its conflicts off-world. He had fought wars against Xenos such as the Orcs, but this did not necessarily enlighten the Raphanon Guard, as their engagements were seemingly focused on planets and areas where they did not encounter other human worlds. This is not documented at least. Vor, however, came to discover the true nature of the Imperium when they defeated the Orc Xenos in one particularly brutal engagement. Off of the back of this, he had expected his soldiers to return home with him to Raphanon. Why would this not be the case? Well, we of course know better. These guard would have been redirected to other engagements for as long as was necessary until they met their end for the Imperium. Very few Imperial Guard ever returned to their homeworlds, because only in death does duty end. For the somewhat naive Vor, this was a crushingly bitter pill to swallow. He had been gifted the reprieve of returning to his homeworld thanks to his lineage, but those serving beneath him were not. None of them would ever see Raphanon again, and they served with both honour and distinction. Who knew instead what miserable circumstances they might have found their death? But this thought haunted Vor, and enraged him steadily. He had seen Imperial citizens fighting for the Imperium, and when their task was completed in his eyes, they were instead given nothing. Vor came to the troubling and accurate realization that no level of courage, honor, or sacrifice would ever be enough for the Imperium. He fought its wars with the weight of flesh and blood of mankind, and in the end their anonymous deaths would not be remembered nor given enough respect. Vor's realization here was not uncommon, to the feeling in fact that many Astartes had during their heresy, that they had fought across the galaxy, but felt there was little if any reward for their sacrifice or that of their brothers, and it is only through the veil of time that we steadily learn they were disturbingly more correct than they may have ever known. But that's another story. When Vor returned to lead the council upon Raphanon, he felt absolutely determined that this world must be freed from the shackles of the Imperium. One might argue a somewhat delusional concept from someone who had presumably seen the scale and might of Imperial firepower firsthand. Perhaps he was clouded by rage and frustration and simply believed his own wild imaginings. Who can say? As I said before, when people's backs are against the wall, anything can seem plausible, even when it makes no sense. Vor may well have rationalized, like so many heretics, that he was not truly a traitor to the Imperium. He merely wanted to free his world from the oppression of the Administrata. And once this was achieved, he might be able to reason with the Imperium to restore their former state of self-governance. Vor, almost unbelievably, thought that the Imperium would not allow itself to be drawn into a grinding war and would look to settle the matter quickly on condition his family remained regional rulers. And at this point, he would be able to maintain the former relationship Raphanon had had with the Imperium. As one might imagine, this was not the wisest of plans. When Vor finally felt the timing was right, an order was sent out to the entirety of the population of Raphanon: rise up and cast off the shackles of your oppressors. This was no ramshackle rebellion instigated by a reactionary group of extremists. It was an orchestrated planet-wide operation planned over decades. The Council of Raphanon had been steadily placing agents across various industrial locations, institutions, so that when rebellious and seditious acts came, there would be no opportunity for the Imperials to withstand the crippling blow that was dealt. Each agent of the rebels knew their task, and they carried out their orders with precision. Such a well-coordinated and abruptly violent action caught the administration completely off guard. Such rebellions would usually only come from violent feral planets, prison colonies, industrial worlds with vast labour forces deployed from different areas of the galaxy, or those corrupted by dark forces and xenos. But from the peaceful and serene planet of Rafalon, none could have predicted this. Yet none of the Imperials even suspected anything of this, until their docile workers were keeping their doors in, summarily executing or violently detaining them for later interrogation, or potentially exchange later down the line. As rebellions against the Imperium go, the actions of the Rafalon populace were up there as one of the cleanest and most well-planned executions, no doubt aided by the seemingly unlikely occurrence of such an action. When all was said and done, many thousands of Imperial officials were dead, quite often as they slept, never knowing who or what had put a projectile weapon, blade or blunt instrument into their head or across their throats. The menial scribes and serfs of the Administratum were not spared. The Rafalon had little empathy for those who worked in the halls of the Imperials. Next came the destruction of the halls and archives of the Administratum. The rebels were now into a full-blown riot and were destroying anything they came upon that held significance to the Administratum. The entire archives were burned, and by the morning the sun was barely visible, as black clouds of choking ash filled the sky. The entire world of Rafalon was now being racked by full-blown rebellion, violent, raging, and unstoppable. Anything that remained of the Administratum was in a complete state of panic and terror. It seemed very much as if the entire world would be lost to the rebels in barely a single day, were it not for one man, Lord General Artemis Blythe. Blythe was a heavily decorated military veteran of the Administratum, and although one does not necessarily think of strong military leadership connected with the Administratum, this is exactly what Blythe was. He had weathered many serious engagements. Most notably, he assumed control of what was known as Army 17, leading an exemplary campaign to scour an entire system of rebels and pirates. Blythe was known for being methodical and efficiently blunt in his orders and demeanour, yet he often would exhibit sparks of tactical inspiration, where others might have fallen back on the security of regimental doctrines. Yet Blythe held imperial doctrines with high regard, and in fact believed that while innovation was valuable and even advantageous, these were only benefits that should be allowed to those heavily schooled in imperial doctrine, and were able to then calmly and objectively weigh up the pros and cons of any given situation. Because of its lush garden nature of a world, Rafalon was often like many garden planets used by high-up Imperials to either retire or recuperate, and so as fate would decide, Lord General Blythe found himself here upon Rafalon for this exact purpose, just as the rebellion broke out. Unfortunately for the population of Rafalon and Vor, the reason Blythe found himself here was because during his last engagement he had refused to stand down as command of operations until the campaign was declared complete. So for Blythe, he literally collapsed from sheer physical exhaustion at the point of final victory. Having such an Imperial veteran military commander upon Rafalon was unfortunate for the rebels, as they would soon discover. Blythe's immediate actions were to launch counterattacks against the concentrations of rebels known to the Imperials. It would have been better to gather information and know more of their enemy, but Blythe balanced this against the immediate threat and felt it was important to push back immediately. Yet the larger issue was simply knowing who he could count on. He would order what Imperial Guard forces they had managed to contact to simply converge on a series of hastily decided objectives. The aim of this was to try and understand who out of the Imperials here would obey and who would side with the rebels. Unfortunately for Blythe, less than 1/3 would follow the orders. The others seemingly had believed the lies of the rebels. But it would soon be discovered that those who had followed their command were in fact off-worlders, and all those guard from Rafalon itself had rejected their chain of command and sided with the rebels. For Blythe, though, it was also discovered soon after that, more concerningly, those loyal forces to him were not even actual trained guard. They were in fact PDF forces who were largely made up of ex-administratum who were deemed surplus and had been redistributed to PDF training camps. They were about as poor quality a trained group as you could imagine. So Blythe, coming to understand not just the situation, but the strength of the force he had to work with, both in numbers and actual trained skill, was deeply depressing. He fought back his feelings of despair, and Blythe's only next course of action was to request reinforcements off-world. In such a situation, a senior Imperial commander will send out astropathic requests at increasing range, and within a few days Blythe had managed to arrange a deployment of Guard to be split off from a larger fleet en route to a different engagement. They would then come to assist and gather a larger force from PDF in a neighbouring system to bolster their strength, finally to arrive at Raphanon some 20 days later. Gathering a force for deployment in such a period of time was extremely uncommon. It was only a combination of luck and the weight of Blythe's rank and prestige that made it possible at all. The coming war would be as bitter a campaign as Blythe had ever encountered, yet he never doubted for a moment that he would be victorious. The only problem was that Vore also shared this sentiment. They were committed at this point and knew that nothing other than victory would save him and the Raphanon people from a fate far worse than all they had so far endured. The result was a grinding war of attrition that saw every piece of ground fought over, with a fury few had imagined they would ever see upon the formerly tranquil world of Raphanon. Blythe's reinforcements were designated as One Rig, or the 1st Raphanon Intervention Group. They deployed to the world some 300 kilometers southeast of the major population centre of Raphanon City, where they would come under the command of Lord General Blythe. In the short time prior to the regular Imperials' arrivals, though, Blythe had managed to somehow organise his paper-thin force of administrative PDF into a moderately acceptable fighting force. No small achievement. He had selected any with military experience and promoted them accordingly, and then focused on merely containing the rebels, disrupting their operations where risk seemed acceptable, but not wanting to spark any true conflicts that would have been unable to be contained. After the initial zeal of their raging assault, things had somewhat quietened down, and Blythe kept his forces away from the population centres and administratum complexes. Instead, they patrolled the dense forests and arboreal terrain between the areas dense with rebels. As well planned and competent as this sounds, this was not handled especially cleanly by those under his command, and while they did have some success with engagements, they often came off the worse for it, and Blythe knew his time was running out. So the reinforcements of One Rig came just in time. Blythe was not only thankful that the regular Imperials had arrived, but also that they had been readily formatted as what the Corps referred to as a heavy planetary assault group. Blythe later was documented as having some affection still for his previously poorly trained paper-thin PDF group of administrative individuals who had held the line despite their litany of shortcomings. But now the real Imperial troops were on the ground and things were moving quickly. Assault operations began a mere 3 days after deployment, and Blythe had briefed the other commanders even as they were deploying logistics and initial site teams to the surface. Blythe's several weeks of planning were now surely going to come to fruition. Phase 1 consisted of elite kill teams of Guard being deployed behind enemy lines to neutralize planetary defenses, and this was urgently necessary to prevent mass casualties as the main force would then deploy to the surface. All were destroyed in line with Blythe's schedule, and the rebels robbed of their use of laser defense and orbital ground missile batteries in what appeared to be a catastrophic oversight on their part. What followed next was an unusually rare deployment technique, in fact nearly unheard of. The first wave of assault would consist of mass-dropped infantry. What this meant was entire companies of each regiment of the Imperial Guard being deployed en masse. That doesn't sound too unusual, but it was the means by which this was achieved, through low-orbit carriers who would position themselves some 50,000 feet or 9.5 miles above the surface. Put that in perspective, Earth's atmosphere is said to extend to only roughly 6 miles above our planet's surface. These low-orbit carriers would then extend via anti-gravity generators a cone of such a field below the ship. The troops would then simply step out of the ship and fall at a steady rate, gentle enough that they would not sustain serious injury upon reaching the surface. Of course, some would require rebreathers because of the atmospheric difference and the ability to breathe, but deployment in this manner is rare, both because of the technology required, but also because asking a regular guardsman to just step out of a ship and descend to a planet's surface with no means of controlling their descent is quite a big ask, not to mention the fact that likely no one bothered to tell them that it is critical in such operations If the ship itself maintained its relative position over a rotating planet, this is hard enough, but that also any undue movement